photocoagulation, what is the typical one which you use? Yes? Which is not used. Okay. Yes, doctor. Basically, you are having krypton, ruby and diode, which we use in the photocoagulation, and the argon. Neodymium, yttrium, aluminium, garnet, NYDA is the one which is used in the photo disruption. And excimer is used for the photo ablation. And carbon dioxide is used for the photo vaporization. So you need to know which scenarios we use all these 4 different techniques is what need to be remembered. Now let us go to the next question. Coming to the juvenile angiofibroma, what is the most common location? There is a small controversy written in the textbook itself, that juvenile angiofibroma is the one, is still a matter of dispute about its origin. It arises from the nasopharynx, but now it is considered that it arises from the sphenopalatine foramen. Forgetting that controversy, we can still put nasopharynx as a possible answer in this given scenario. Abductor of the vocal cords, adductors, so this is a standard question. Granulosa cell tumor produces estrogen, that is the reason breast atrophy is not seen. Precocious puberty is very much seen. Menorrhagia it can cause. York-Sack tumor, Leydig cell tumor is the one which is the masculinizing tumor. Kelly's suture in the case of the stress incontinence. Histosalpingogram per se can precipitate and worsen the tubercular salpingitis is what need to be remembered. It is the seminal vesicles which will be responsible for the sweet fructose content in the semen is what need to be remembered. And the prostate supplies the citric acid, phosphate and zinc, and that is how the semen is made up of. In a menopause, typically FSH falls down is a wrong statement. LHFSH increases, estrogen falls down is a very well-known statement. Now in a 25-year-old, if there is a Bartholin cyst, what do you want to do? Incision drainage, or do you want to do marsupialization? Now I thought that we can skip this question straight away. Why excision should not be, is the second choice, and okay, I like to ask you another way. What age group patient excision is indicated? If there is a Bartholin cyst above 40, because there is a high possibility that a 40-year-old lady presenting with the Bartholin cyst is more likely to home a adenocarcinoma of the Bartholin. In order to rule out and find out whether there is any adenocarcinoma, we need to do the excision. But if the age group is 45 and above, is what need to be remembered. So there is a reason, doctor, there are 2 important procedures that we commonly do for the Bartholin cyst. One is called the word catheter, where we incise it. But if it is typically a abscess along with the cyst, we use it. Alternative to the word catheter placement is the marsupialization of the Bartholin cyst, which is the common procedure which is done. But typically marsupialization should not be used if at all there is any abscess. Was it Bartholin abscess or Bartholin cyst? What was given in the exam? Okay. If you answered wrong for a while, you remember that probably abscess would have been given, and there is a better day for us. So marsupialization is a typical procedure where you try to invert within it. And excision typically is done when the conservative methods happen to fail, and typically when there is no active infection, and in all the women who are more than 40 years of age group is what need to be basically remembered. Another 66 questions for us to complete the discussion, which we will complete. And across the state, in all the places, everyone is waiting to see this discussion. So there were some inconsistencies in the frame of the question in our yesterday's discussion. They all had been filled, and let us take up the next question. The Coiner's method of sterilization, what exactly it is, was the question asked. So basically we have Pomeroy, modified Pomeroy, Uchida, Irving, and the Kroner's fimbriectomy. They are the various methods, as all of you know very well. So to quickly review, doctor, a simple ligation of the fallopian tube in continuity can also be done. And there is another method called Maedliner's method. What is that? It is the crushing and ligation of the loop of the tube is typically called the Maedliner's method. Pomeroy means the ligature around a loop of the tube and then excising it is basically called the Pomeroy. You have the Irving method where a double ligature excision of the tubal segment is done, and then you will be concealing the proximal end by burying it into the myometrium, and the distal end by burying it into the broad ligament is basically called the Irving method. Uchida method is basically the tubal serosa is stripped from the muscular cord and the tubal segment is excised and the proximal end is ligated and buried in the broad ligament is basically called as the Uchida's method. And the Croiner's method introduced in 1969 is fimbriectomy, ligation of the distal end of the tube and the mesosalpinx, and the excision of the fimbriated end in totality is basically called the Croiner's method is the one which has come out as question. So I hope that some of you who are taking the exam 2008 AP entrance, Uchida's method is waiting for you because too many proper nouns came in this exam. Now let us talk about the gout. In fact, it is more like a TOEFL exam, our state entrance. Suppose if there is a paragraph, there will be questions framed on that paragraph. That's what is done in TOEFL, etc. It's called what precise writing and all that we used to do. So as one of our students was telling that Davidson writes that a gout patient cannot be comfortable to wear the socks, then MCQ will be created as he can wear the socks comfortably becomes an option. So that is the reason probably reading the lines more carefully is important, and much more carefully is probably seeing one patient of gout will make you to answer this question. It is the distal joint involvement is the presentation. It is the worst pain which is ever felt by the patient. He cannot wear the socks in spite of the, he cannot wear the socks because of the pain, and it involves the first metatarsophalangeal is what need to be basically remembered. It is the podagra, other name which is given for this metatarsophalangeal joint involvement is what I want to underscore to all of you. That is the reason one of the common clinical dictum which we should not forget. Any acute monoarticular arthritis of any peripheral joint shall be assumed to be, unless proven otherwise, to be a case of gout, except the glenohumeral joint, because glenohumeral joint is more likely to be associated with the pseudo-gout. Otherwise, any peripheral joints monoarticular arthritis is consistent with the diagnosis of the gout is what I want to underscore to all of you. This is a very interesting question. Where do we use the amiloride? I'll take a couple of minutes of your time to answer this question. The first, let us talk about the Liddle syndrome. What exactly happens in Liddle's? There is a sodium membrane, there is a sodium receptor. Typically, in the case of the Liddle syndrome, there is a problem with the sodium channel. The epithelial sodium channel typically has got a constitutive activation which happens in Liddle syndrome, and because of this activation there is an abnormal reabsorption of the sodium which will happen, hence the sodium lost into the urine become decreased. So there is a low urinary sodium excretion, high urinary potassium along with hypokalemia and volume expansion, and because of that volume expansion there is a development of hypertension. So what happens exactly in the Liddle syndrome is excess sodium retention, and consequent to that excess water reabsorption and excess loss of potassium into the urine is the underlying problem, is what I want to underscore to all of you. So for this, what is the treatment of choice? Naturally we need to take care of the salt restriction, because already sodium is getting excessively reabsorbed into the body. Second is we need to give triamterene, a very important drug, and in this scenario spironolactone is ineffective is what I want to underscore. So there are two important agents which will help to stop that process of excessive sodium reabsorption which is happening. One is triamterene, other is the amiloride, but not the spironolactone as a treatment of the Liddle syndrome is what you need to finally remember. At least in the next entrance we are very sure what is the question going to come. Liddle's and Barter's, invariably questions come in every entrance, doctor. Already we discussed in a great detail in medicine discussion, so that's the reason I cut short. Now, is there any role for the amiloride in the cystic fibrosis? Let us talk about it. Typically in the cystic fibrosis, what they found is there is a unique abnormality in the airway epithelium. Once more, the problem is in the airway epithelial channels, there is excess reabsorption of the sodium. So that is the reason there is a thickened mucosa, a clogging of the mucosa, with the airway obstruction is the underlying problem. So if you want to stop the sodium reabsorption which is excessive, the best drug to use is once more amiloride in the case of the cystic fibrosis also. So it is used in the Liddle syndrome and also in the cystic fibrosis. Now let us talk about the diabetes insipidus, another favorite topic of the examiner. What is diabetes insipidus, doctor? Basically ADH, which is expected to act on the cortical collecting duct and cause the water reabsorption and prevent the diuresis from happening, is the one which is not functioning in the case of the diabetes insipidus. It can happen either because ADH production centrally itself is impaired or the ADH action on the collecting duct is impaired. Accordingly, you have a central diabetes insipidus and nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. Now, how do you want to take care of the diabetes insipidus basically? What is the management of diabetes insipidus? Is the diabetes insipidus a diuretic state or a non-diuretic state? It is a diuretic state. But the biggest paradox is, for treating a diuretic state, we treat it by giving a diuretic. So what is the logic behind it? It's very simple. How can the diuretic can treat diuresis? Basically, why there is diuresis in diabetes insipidus, doctor? Because there is no availability of action of the antidiuretic hormone. Because of that, where is the water lost? It is from the collecting duct. The water is getting lost. So suppose if you prevent the availability of the water itself at the collecting duct, right? So it is that scenario at which you can prevent diuresis, because the defect lies with the collecting duct. Avoid the water availability at the level of the collecting duct. Whenever the water reaches the collecting duct from the proximal tubule to the collecting duct, it is expected to get reabsorbed. In the diabetes insipidus, what happens? Because antidiuretic hormone is not there, when the water reaches the collecting duct from the proximal tubule, it reaches the collecting duct, it is not reabsorbed, hence it is lost into the urine, hence there is a development of diuresis. So try to do something or other, because the problem is lying there with the collecting duct. Don't let water to reach collecting duct itself. Then you can be able to prevent the diuresis. How can you achieve that? Very simple. If at all you give any diuretic, these diuretics will decrease the extracellular fluid. Any decrease of the extracellular fluid will make the proximal tubule to become thirsty. The moment extracellular fluid falls down, proximal tubule thinks, why the extracellular fluid has fallen down? Then immediately as the water enters, it starts excessively reabsorbing the water at the level of the proximal tubule. So that is the reason, doctor, by giving a diuretic, our purpose is to decrease the extracellular fluid and stimulate the proximal tubule to cause the water reabsorption. And when all the water got reabsorbed, the amount of the water reaching the distal tubule is less. Hence the problem at the distal tubule, though it is there in diabetes insipidus, still diuresis won't happen. So that is the whole purpose of giving a diuretic to treat the diabetes insipidus, though the diabetes insipidus by itself is a diuretic state is what need to be remembered. Now the question comes, which diuretic do you want to use? Do you want to use thiazides? Do you want to use spironolactone? Do you want to use amiloride? Then which is better over the other is a very important